April 28, 1945. The end was brutal and public. Benito Mussolini, the man who ruled Italy for 2 decades, faced a firing squad. His body was later hung upside down in a Milan gas station. It was a humiliating spectacle for the former dictator. Crowds threw stones and spat on the corpse. This was the final act of a life defined by violence. Mussolini was born on July 29, 1883. The location was Predappio, a small town in northern Italy. His father, Alessandro, worked as a blacksmith. Alessandro was a committed socialist. He spent his evenings reading the works of Karl Marx and talking about revolution. His mother, Rosa Maltoni, was a school teacher. She provided the discipline and religious structure in the house. The child was a product of these two extremes. His name itself was a political statement. Alessandro named him Benito after Benito Juarez, the Mexican revolutionary who overthrew a monarchy. Why did the father choose this name? He wanted his son to be a rebel. The plan worked. From his early years, Mussolini was aggressive. He did not just argue with other children, he fought them. In the classroom, he was intelligent but volatile. He excelled in writing and public speaking, finding that words could influence people as much as fists. At 10 years old, his parents sent him to a strict Catholic boarding school. The footage from his later years shows a man of iron, but as a teenager, he was simply a delinquent. At the boarding school, he stabbed a fellow student with a penknife. The school expelled him immediately. This was not an isolated incident. This violent streak became a permanent part of his character. As a young man, Mussolini turned to journalism. He used the pen as a weapon. He became a socialist, just like his father. He wrote articles for radical newspapers. He organized strikes. He demanded rights for the working class. In 1909, he moved to Trento. At the time, the city belonged to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. At first glance, he was a simple editor, but in reality, he was a dangerous agitator. He took over a newspaper called The Future of the Worker. He wrote articles attacking the government and the church. His words were so sharp that the authorities took notice. The police watched his every move. Soon they moved in. The police arrested him and deported him back to Italy. It was his first taste of state power. It would not be his last. He realized that to change the world, he needed more than a newspaper. He needed a movement. Events accelerated. The socialist journalist was about to transform into something else entirely. There was no turning back.
1912. By this year, Benito Mussolini was a leading name in the Italian Socialist Party. He did not just write articles, he organized strikes, led street protests, and commanded the masses with aggressive speeches. His words were a weapon against the government. Why did the socialists trust him? He spoke their language. But his loyalty had a price. In 1914, the First World War began. At first, Mussolini followed the socialist line of strict neutrality. He argued that Italy must stay out of the conflict. Then, his perspective shifted. He saw the war as an opportunity for expansion and national power. This shift was a direct betrayal of his party's core principles. By the end of 1914, the socialists expelled him. He did not disappear. He changed his identity from a socialist to a radical nationalist. He founded a new newspaper titled Il Popolo d'Italia. Through its pages, he promoted militarism and intense patriotism. He demanded that Italy enter the global conflict. 1915. Italy joined the war on the side of Britain and France. Mussolini did not stay behind a desk. He joined the army and moved to the front lines. The footage from this era shows him in uniform. In 1917, a mortar shell exploded during a training exercise. Shrapnel tore into his body. The military discharged him after he recovered from his wounds. The war ended in 1918, but there was no peace. Italy was a landscape of wreckage and fury. Soldiers returned from the trenches expecting land and respect. Instead, they found a ruined economy. Inflation erased savings. Jobs did not exist. In the cities, the sound of glass breaking became common as riots broke out. At first glance, Italy was a victor in the war. But in reality, it was a failing state. The government in Rome was paralyzed. Political factions fought in the streets with clubs and knives. No one was in control. Events accelerated. This vacuum of power was exactly what Mussolini needed. Thus, the stage was set for a new order. 1919. Benito Mussolini saw a vacuum in Italian power and moved to fill it. He founded the Fasci di Combattimento. This movement was a volatile mix of nationalism, militarism, and absolute authoritarianism. He made two specific promises. First, he would restore Italy to the height of the Roman Empire. Second, he would liquidate the communists. He blamed them for every strike, every food shortage, and every failing in the country. Mussolini did not work alone. He had the black shirts. These were paramilitary squads composed of war veterans and disillusioned youth. They acted as thugs. They burned down socialist headquarters, smashed trade union offices, and beat political opponents in the streets. The smell of castor oil and the sound of breaking glass followed them everywhere. At first, the movement failed. In the 1919 elections, Mussolini did not win a single seat in parliament. He was a political outsider with no official power. But this changed over the next 5 years. The Italian government was paralyzed. The economy was in ruins. People were desperate for a strongman to end the chaos. Mussolini watched the instability and waited for his moment. How did he gain legitimacy? He stopped being a street brawler and became a politician. In 1921, he officially formed the National Fascist Party. Support flooded in from the middle class, wealthy business owners, and the high-ranking military. These groups shared one common fear: a communist revolution like the one in Russia. They saw Mussolini as a necessary evil. By 1922, Italy reached a breaking point. Strikes paralyzed the factories. Protests turned into riots. Mussolini saw the state was crumbling and prepared a coup. On October 28, 1922, the March on Rome began. Thousands of blackshirts moved toward the capital. They were armed and demanding power. They wanted Mussolini named prime minister. King Victor Emmanuel III held the fate of the country. He had the army at his disposal. He could have ordered the soldiers to fire on the fascists and end the march in an hour. But he hesitated. He looked at the crowds and feared a bloody civil war. He also believed he could manipulate Mussolini once he was in office. On October 29, 1922, the king surrendered. He officially appointed Mussolini as prime minister. The gamble failed. Mussolini did not want to be a puppet. He immediately began dismantling the machinery of democracy. He censored the press, banned opposition parties, and took over the courts. By 1925, the transition was complete. Mussolini held absolute control over Italy. The era of the dictator had begun. 1925. Benito Mussolini declared himself Il Duce. This title meant the leader. For nearly 20 years, he controlled Italy with absolute authority. He did not allow rivals. He dissolved opposing political parties, censored every newspaper, and established a pervasive police state. His paramilitary force, the Blackshirts, patrolled the streets. They used clubs and castor oil to silence critics. Anyone who spoke against the regime faced immediate violence. Why did the public tolerate him? At first glance, a national hero, but in reality, a master of theater. Mussolini launched massive construction projects to show strength. Workers built highways and drained the Pontine marshes to create farmland. He wanted the world to see a modern, industrial Italy. However, the reality was different. These projects were expensive propaganda. The economy remained stagnant. Unemployment stayed high while the state spent millions on grand monuments and parades. Events accelerated. In 1935, Mussolini looked toward Africa. He invaded Ethiopia to build a new Roman Empire. His generals did not hold back. They used mustard gas and aerial bombardments against tribesmen. International observers were horrified. The League of Nations issued formal condemnations, but no one took military action to stop the slaughter. Mussolini watched the world's reaction. He concluded he was invincible. In the frame, Mussolini stands next to Adolf Hitler. By 1936, the two dictators formed a bond. They shared a hatred for democracy and a hunger for territory. In May 1939, they signed the Pact of Steel. This was a formal military alliance. If one went to war, the other followed. It was a suicide pact for the Italian nation. September 1939, World War II began. Mussolini hesitated for 9 months. He knew his military was weak, but on June 10, 1940, he made his move. He declared war on Great Britain and France. He expected a quick victory. He wanted to seize Mediterranean lands while Hitler did the heavy lifting. There was no turning back. The footage shows Italian soldiers marching with outdated equipment. The war was a disaster from the start. In Greece, the Italian army retreated in freezing mountains. In North Africa, they lost thousands of men to British tanks. In Russia, Italian divisions were wiped out in the snow. By 1943, the Italian people were starving. The Allied forces landed in Sicily. The grand dream of an empire had vanished. His popularity evaporated. The court of public opinion delivered its verdict. 1943. By the middle of the year, Benito Mussolini was losing control. The military situation was a disaster. On the front lines, Italian soldiers lacked supplies and ammunition. Morale collapsed. Back home, the population faced hunger and constant aerial debt. The facade of the powerful fascist state was cracking. July 9, 1943. Allied forces landed on the beaches of Sicily. This wasn't a skirmish. It was a full-scale invasion of Italian soil. The push into the mainland began. In Rome, the halls of power turned quiet. King Victor Emmanuel III watched the maps. High-ranking officials whispered in corridors. They reached a single conclusion: Mussolini had to go. July 24, 1943. The fascist Grand Council gathered for a secret meeting. The room was tense. For the first time in 2 decades, men spoke against the Duce. They held a vote on his leadership. The result was clear. Mussolini lost. The following afternoon, July 25th, Mussolini arrived at the royal palace in Rome. He expected a routine briefing. Instead, he met the king. Victor Emmanuel III spoke coldly. He stripped Mussolini of his powers. The king named Marshal Pietro Badoglio as the new leader of Italy. Mussolini walked out of the palace. He didn't reach his car. Carabinieri officers intercepted him immediately. They forced him into an ambulance. He was under arrest. The new government was nervous. They feared a fascist uprising or a German rescue mission. They moved him constantly, first to an island, then to a naval base. Finally, they took him to the Hotel Campo Imperatore. It was a remote building high in the Gran Sasso Mountains. The Abruzzo region was rugged and cold. The location was a natural prison. No roads, no easy access. Mussolini was cut off from the world, but the war didn't stop. Italy changed direction. September 8, 1943. The Italian government signed an armistice with the Allied powers. It was an official surrender. The alliance with Germany was dead. Italian troops received new orders. They stopped fighting the Americans and the British. In many sectors, the situation turned violent. Former brothers in arms became enemies. Italian soldiers turned their rifles toward the German units stationed beside them. The transition was bloody. The era of the Duce was over. September 12, 1943. Mussolini's story was supposed to end in a mountain prison. But Adolf Hitler refused to accept the defeat of his ally. He ordered a rescue. German paratroopers launched Operation Oak. They used gliders to land silently at the Gran Sasso Hotel. The footage from that day shows the paratroopers rushing the entrance. They overpowered the Italian guards. Not a single shot was fired. Mussolini walked out a free man. But what was the price of this freedom? Hitler placed him at the head of a puppet state in northern Italy. It was called the Italian Social Republic, or the Republic of Salo. At first glance, a new government. but in reality, a German cage. Mussolini no longer made decisions. He signed documents, he gave speeches, but the power belonged to the German generals. Mussolini was a shadow. The camera records his sunken face and vacant eyes. He had no real authority. He had no army. His fate was already sealed by the advancing front lines.
It got worse. By late April 1945, the end arrived. Nazi Germany was collapsing under the weight of Allied bombs and Soviet tanks. Italy fell into total chaos. Allied divisions pushed from the south. Italian partisan resistance fighters rose up in the north. They were closing in on the last fascist strongholds. Town after town fell. The partisan groups liberated Milan and Turin. The fascist regime wasn't just losing, it was crumbling into dust. Mussolini knew the clock had stopped. He watched as his loyal supporters burned their uniforms and disappeared. Even the Germans were negotiating their own surrender behind his back. Where could he go? He had no soldiers left to command. Every road was blocked by enemies. The war was lost. There was no turning back. April 25, 1945. The end of the road began here. April 25, 1945. Benito Mussolini stood in the center of Milan. This was his last stronghold. He planned to gather his remaining forces and turn the city into a fortress. He expected thousands of loyal blackshirts to arrive. But the streets were empty. The Fascist Party had dissolved overnight. The reality was visible from the palace windows. The people of Milan were not hiding. They were revolting. Partisans seized government buildings and took control of the radio stations. Mussolini was trapped in a city that wanted him dead. Cardinal Alfredo Ildefonso Schuster intervened. He sent a message to the dictator. The archbishop offered a meeting at his palace to negotiate a surrender to the National Liberation Committee. Mussolini arrived. He sat across from the resistance leaders. They demanded unconditional surrender. Mussolini refused. He stood up and walked out. He still believed in a miracle. Mussolini fled Milan. He did not go alone. A small group of loyalists followed him in a convoy of black cars. They headed north toward Lake Como. The engine noise echoed against the mountain walls. There was no clear destination. He considered Germany, but the Third Reich was a graveyard. The roads were blocked by Allied bombers and burning wreckage. He turned his eyes toward Switzerland. It was a neutral border. If he could cross the line, he could escape the gallows. Clara Petacci stayed by his side. She refused every order to leave. She packed her bags and joined the convoy. Several high-ranking fascist officials and a unit of German SS soldiers provided the escort. Mussolini knew his face was too famous for the open road. He made a choice. He took off his uniform. He put on a gray Luftwaffe overcoat and a German steel helmet. He sat in the back of a German truck, hunched over, pretending to be a drunk corporal. He hoped the heavy wool and the shadows would hide his jawline. The convoy moved along the narrow roads of Lake Como. To the left was the water. To the right were the cliffs. The plan was a simple gamble. They would use the German soldiers as a shield to pass through partisan roadblocks. Once they reached the border, Mussolini would vanish. The sound of a whistle broke the silence. It was the morning of April 27, 1945. The convoy ground to a halt. Armed men in civilian clothes stood in the middle of the road. The partisans had arrived. Events accelerated. There was no turning back. April 27, 1945. The convoy reached the town of Dongo on the western shore of Lake Como. This was a choke point. The 57th Garibaldi Brigade held the territory. These were communist resistance fighters, hardened by mountain warfare. They were not looking for soldiers, they were hunting for fugitives. Pierluigi Bellini dalla Sella and Urbano Lazzaro commanded the unit. They had established roadblocks using stone and timber. No one passed without an inspection. When the convoy halted, the partisans leveled their rifles and demanded a total German surrender. The German officers looked at the roadblock and then at their watches. The war was lost. Resistance was a waste of ammunition. The Germans disarmed. They stepped out of their vehicles and stacked their Mauser rifles on the pavement. The partisans began the search.
They moved from truck to truck, pulling back heavy canvas flaps. They found what they were looking for. Italian fascists were hiding among the German ranks. One by one, government ministers and high-ranking military officers were dragged into the light. But where was the leader? Mussolini sat in the back of a German transport truck. He wore a standard-issue German greatcoat and a steel helmet pulled low over his eyes. He remained motionless. He did not speak. He hoped the shadows of the truck bed would hide his profile. Urbano Lazzaro climbed onto the vehicle. He scanned the faces of the soldiers. He stopped at a short, stocky man with a pale complexion. The man sat slumped against the wooden slats. Lazzaro recognized the jawline. He recognized the eyes. In the footage from that day, the man looks exhausted. His skin is sallow. There is no sign of the dictator who once spoke from the balcony of the Palazzo Venezia. Lazzaro ordered the man to stand. Mussolini obeyed. He moved slowly. He did not resist as the partisans stripped away the German helmet and the gray wool coat. The disguise fell away. There was no doubt left. The Duce was captured. The partisans moved him to a farmhouse in the village of Bonzanico. 2 guards stood at the door with submachine guns. Inside, the resistance leaders argued. Some wanted to wait for the Allied high command. Others wanted immediate blood. At first glance, a prisoner of war, but in reality, a man facing a death sentence. To the partisans, Mussolini was no longer a head of state. He was a target. The debate did not last long. The story reached its final stage. April 28, 1945, 6 in the morning. The air in northern Italy was cold and the sky remained gray. The war in Europe was in its final days. In a small village near Lake Como, the end of Benito Mussolini was approaching. Why did the partisans act so quickly? The Allies were advancing, but the local resistance wanted to settle the score themselves. Orders arrived at dawn from the National Liberation Committee in Milan. They chose Walter Audizio for the task. His code name was Colonel Valerio. He was a veteran partisan leader with one objective. Audizio gathered a small squad, checked his weapons, and moved toward the target. 2 in the afternoon. Audizio and his men reached the farmhouse. They did not knock. They ordered Mussolini and his mistress, Claretta Petacci, out of the building. The footage from history shows a red Alfa Romeo waiting. The 2 were forced into the vehicle. The car drove through the quiet streets of Giuliano di Mazzegra. It stopped at a stone wall near the entrance of Villa Belmonte. The engine cut out. The partisans ordered the pair to step onto the dirt road. Petacci gripped Mussolini's arm. She refused to let go. The soldiers forced them against the wall. At exactly 4:10 in the afternoon, the silence broke. Audizio raised a French MAS-38 submachine gun. He pulled the trigger. The weapon jammed at first. He cleared the bolt and fired again. The first bullets hit Mussolini in the chest. Petacci screamed and lunged toward him. She was hit by the next burst. Both bodies collapsed into the gravel. But the shooting continued. The partisans unloaded their magazines into the corpses. The autopsy reports vary. Some records show Mussolini was hit 12 times. Other sources claim more than 40 bullets tore through his body. The sound of gunfire echoed off the stone for several minutes. But for the resistance, death was not enough. Simply killing the dictator was not seen as justice. It was only the beginning of a final public humiliation. The bodies were loaded into a van. They were headed for Milan. Thus ended the era of the Duce. 28 bullets. That was the count after the partisans finished their work. Benito Mussolini and Clara Petacci were dead. Soldiers threw their bodies into the back of an open truck. They piled the corpses of other high-ranking fascist officials on top of them like sandbags. The partisans made no attempt to hide the execution. They did the opposite. The truck began a slow, deliberate procession through the countryside. It stopped in town after town. They paraded the remains before the public. By 3 in the morning on April 29, 1945, the vehicle reached Milan. News had traveled faster than the engine. Thousands of people were already waiting in the streets. The destination was Piazzale Loreto. This was a calculated choice. The partisans wanted a specific symbol, Less than a year earlier, on August 10, 1944, the fascist regime had used this exact square for a massacre. They executed 15 resistance fighters. The fascists left those bodies on the concrete for hours. The sun beat down on them while flies swarmed the wounds. It was a warning to the city. 9 months later, the roles reversed. The truck entered the square and tilted its bed. The bodies slid out and hit the pavement like bags of refuse. The crowd did not wait. They surged forward. People began kicking Mussolini in the ribs and the face. The sound of heavy boots hitting bone filled the air. Others leaned over to spit on the remains. The violence escalated. Men drew pistols and fired point blank into the lifeless chest of the dictator. Clara Petacci's body received the same treatment. She held no official office, but the mob saw her as part of the machine. They beat her. They tore at her clothing. They kicked her until her features were unrecognizable. The other fascist officials lay nearby, absorbing blows and insults. But the crowd focused their rage on Mussolini. For hours, the square became a scene of systematic desecration. There were no police to stop it. There was only the sound of gunfire, shouting, and impact. The footage shows a mass of limbs and mud. The era of the Duce ended in the dirt of a public square. Loreto Square, 1945. The partisans decided the execution was not enough. They moved to a gas station on the edge of the square. There, they found a heavy metal beam. The plan was simple. They would hang the bodies upside down for the entire city to see. 6 corpses lay in the dirt: Mussolini, Petacci, and 4 high-ranking fascists. The crowd watched as men looped thick ropes around the ankles of the dead. They used sharp meat hooks to secure the weight. The bodies were hauled upward. They dangled from the rafters of the Standard Oil station. Was this necessary? It depended on who you asked. Winston Churchill watched the reports from London. He had spent years fighting the dictator. Later, Churchill wrote about his reaction. He stated that execution was a political necessity, but the public mutilation of a corpse was something else entirely. He found the images disturbing, but the locals felt differently. The square was packed. People shouted. They threw stones at the swaying bodies. For many Italians, this was justice. It was a physical release after 20 years of dictatorship, hunger, and war. They wanted to see the man who broke Italy broken himself. The spectacle lasted several hours. Finally, the local authorities intervened. They ordered the bodies to be lowered. Soldiers placed the remains into cheap, unpainted wooden coffins. A truck transported them to a local morgue for an autopsy. The government faced a problem. What do you do with the body of a tyrant? They feared his supporters. If the grave was known, it would become a shrine for fascists. They chose Musocco Cemetery outside of Milan. They dug a hole in an unmarked section. No headstone, no name, just dirt. But the story did not end there. 1946, 1 year after the war. A group of hardcore fascists arrived at the cemetery at night. They dug up the remains and stole the body. For months, Mussolini's corpse traveled across Italy in secret. They moved from safe house to monastery. The goal was a formal fascist burial. The authorities began a nationwide manhunt. They eventually tracked the remains to a small convent. For the next 11 years, the Italian government kept the body a state secret. They hid it in a cupboard inside a monastery. Then they moved it to a police station. They wanted the world to forget he ever existed. But the family did not stop asking. In 1957, the government finally surrendered. They allowed the remains to be returned to his hometown of Predoppio. The body was placed in a family crypt. Today, the tomb remains open. The footage shows a steady stream of people. Some visitors are die-hard supporters who still wear the black shirts. Others are simply curious. They stand in silence before the stone monument. The man is gone, but the site remains a flashpoint of history.